The first words my sister spoke to me at our father's funeral weren't, "I'm sorry for your loss." They were, "You're unbelievable, Carmela. Couldn't you wear a simple black dress for once? Or did you really need to steal the spotlight from Dad one last time?" Her voice rang across the quiet cemetery, loud enough for every grieving relative to hear. A few of my cousins exchanged awkward smiles. Someone near the back actually laughed. I stood perfectly still beside my father's flag-draped casket, wearing my formal military dress uniform exactly as he had asked me to. I had flown home less than 24 hours earlier after ending a months-long deployment. I hadn't slept. I hadn't even unpacked my duffel bag. The only thing that mattered was keeping one final promise to my father. He had made me give it months before he passed. "Come in uniform," he had whispered from his hospital bed. "I want everyone to see the woman you've become." Those words echoed in my mind while my sister glared at me as though I had committed some unforgivable crime. "Look at her," she continued, folding her arms. She couldn't let Dad have one day that wasn't about her. Several relatives nodded. They had believed my sister's version of me for years. According to her, I had abandoned the family when I joined the military. I cared more about medals than birthdays, more about promotions than holidays, more about strangers than my own father. None of them knew how many holidays I had spent staring at photographs of home from thousands of miles away. None of them knew how many emergency calls I had tried to answer between missions. None of them knew how many nights I cried because duty had kept me from saying goodbye to people I loved. They only knew the story my sister had told, and she had told it well. She stepped closer until only a few feet separated us. "You always loved attention," she said. "Even now, with Dad lying right here, you still found a way to make this about yourself." I looked at her without raising my voice. "I'm here to honor Dad." She rolled her eyes. "No," she snapped. "You're here to show off." Silence settled over the mourners. The funeral director looked uncomfortable. Even the honor guard standing nearby remained motionless. Then my sister's husband, Daniel, who had remained unusually quiet since the service began, looked toward my shoulders. His expression changed instantly. His eyes locked onto the silver eagle insignia on my uniform. The color drained from his face. He took one slow step backward, then another. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he looked at my sister and said, "Do you have any idea who you've just humiliated?" Daniel's question hung in the air, but before anyone could answer him, my mind drifted backward through years of memories I had spent trying to bury. My sister, Vanessa, had always been our mother's favorite. She was charming, outgoing, and knew exactly what people wanted to hear. If she forgot a birthday, there was always an excuse. If she made a mistake, someone else was blamed. Every achievement of hers was celebrated as though it were a family triumph. I was different, quiet, disciplined, the child who followed the rules without expecting applause. Growing up, I learned that being responsible rarely earned attention. It simply meant more responsibility. When Vanessa crashed Dad's truck at 17, I was told to help pay for the repairs from my part-time job because families stick together. When she dropped out of college after 2 semesters, my parents quietly covered every bill. When I earned a scholarship to a military academy, nobody threw a party. Mom only sighed and said, "You're really leaving us?" It never seemed to matter that I had worked for everything I achieved. My uniforms, my education, my promotions. Every step forward came through sacrifice, long hours, and years away from home. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued living only 20 minutes from our parents. She visited often, but every visit came with complaints about money, childcare, or some new problem that someone else needed to solve. Somehow, she was always the victim. And somehow, I was always the selfish daughter. The distance made it easy for the story to grow. Whenever I missed Christmas because I was deployed overseas, Vanessa told relatives I didn't care enough to come. When military duty kept me from Thanksgiving, she said I had chosen my career over my family. No one asked why. No one wondered whether I had a choice. Over time, those stories became accepted as truth. Even my father's attempts to defend me were usually met with silence. His health had declined over the last few years, and family arguments only exhausted him. Rather than create more conflict, he often changed the subject, leaving me to carry the weight of misunderstandings alone. Still, despite everything, he called whenever he could. Sometimes our conversations lasted only a few minutes. He never asked why I couldn't visit more often. He already knew. Before I deployed for the last time, he told me something I didn't fully understand until much later. One day, he said quietly, "People will see you for who you really are, not for the story they've been told." Standing beside his casket now, I realized that day had finally arrived. Long before I ever wore silver eagles on my shoulders, there had been years when I wondered whether I would make it through the week. Leaving home at 18 wasn't some dramatic act of rebellion. It was survival. I knew that if I stayed, I would spend the rest of my life living in my sister's shadow, apologizing for dreams that somehow made everyone else uncomfortable. Military training was harder than anything I had imagined. There were mornings when my body ached so badly I could barely climb out of bed. There were nights when I questioned whether I belonged there at all. Around me were people who seemed stronger, faster, and more confident. Whenever self-doubt crept in, I remembered every time someone back home had called me the disappointing daughter. Instead of quitting, I worked harder. My first years in the service were far from glamorous. My paycheck disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. I rented a tiny apartment just large enough for a bed, a small table, and a second-hand bookshelf. Most evenings were spent studying military leadership manuals, completing professional development courses, and preparing for promotion exams while eating inexpensive meals that stretched my budget. There were weekends when friends went out together, but I stayed home to save money and focus on my goals. No one forced me to do it. I simply refused to let my future be written by the people who believed I would never succeed. Every promotion represented another early morning, another difficult assignment, another lesson learned through discipline rather than luck. Over the years, I served in places most people only saw on the evening news. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, and holidays. The loneliness was real, but so was the purpose that carried me through it. Whenever I called home, the conversations rarely lasted long. My sister usually dominated the family news, while my own experiences were met with polite silence or quickly forgotten. Eventually, I stopped chasing their approval. I focused instead on becoming someone my father could be proud of, and someone I could respect whenever I looked in the mirror. Standing beside his casket now, I realized every sacrifice, every lonely night, and every difficult step had quietly led me to this moment. Even if my family had never bothered to notice, the funeral ended just before sunset. One by one, the relatives drifted toward their cars, speaking in hushed voices that sounded very different from the laughter I had heard only a few hours earlier. No one stopped me as I walked away. No one repeated the accusations. Even Vanessa remained silent, avoiding my eyes while Daniel stood beside her with an expression I couldn't quite read. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days after I returned to my duty station, my phone began vibrating before sunrise. One missed call, then another. By breakfast, there were 12. By lunch, more than 30. By evening, my voicemail was overflowing. Most of the calls came from relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years. Aunts, uncles, cousins, even family friends who had barely acknowledged my existence while my father was alive. The text messages followed. Asterisk, we're sorry if there was a misunderstanding. Asterisk, asterisk, your sister didn't mean what she said. Asterisk, asterisk, families shouldn't stay angry. Asterisk, asterisk, can we talk? Asterisk, not one message actually apologized for humiliating me. At my father's funeral. Instead, every word seemed carefully written to avoid admitting responsibility. I ignored them all. The following afternoon, an unfamiliar number appeared on my phone. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail. Something told me to answer. Colonel Carmela Brooks, the calm voice asked. This is she. My name is Michael Reynolds. I'm the attorney handling your father's estate. Your father left instructions that could only be carried out after the funeral service was completed. I sat down without realizing it. My father's estate? Yes, ma'am. There is a handwritten letter addressed specifically to you, along with several legal documents that were not to be shared until after the burial. Before I could ask another question, he added something that made my heart pound. Your sister and several other family members have already contacted my office multiple times this week. I frowned. About what? There was a brief pause. They appear to believe your father left everything to them. Then, in the same measured tone, he said the words that explained every frantic phone call I had received. They have absolutely no idea what your father actually put in his will. A week later, I walked into Michael Reynolds' law office wearing a simple navy blue suit instead of my military uniform. The conference room was already full. Vanessa sat at one end of the polished table, arms folded tightly across her chest. Daniel sat beside her, unusually quiet. My mother stared out the window, avoiding eye contact, while several aunts and uncles whispered among themselves. The conversation stopped the moment I entered. Michael greeted everyone politely before placing a sealed envelope and a thick folder on the table. "Your father left very specific instructions," he began. "He asked that his final letter be read before any discussion of his estate." He unfolded several handwritten pages. "If you're hearing this," he read, "then my daughters have already buried me. Before anyone talks about money, I need you to hear the truth I should have spoken while I was alive." The room fell silent. Carmela never abandoned this family. She answered a calling that required more courage than I ever had. Every birthday she missed, every holiday she spent away, and every sacrifice she made was done in service to something greater than herself. I have always been proud of her. I saw my mother's eyes fill with tears. Vanessa stared at the table. Michael continued. "For years, I stayed quiet because I believed peace was more important than confrontation. Instead, my silence allowed lies to become accepted as truth. That failure belongs to me, not to my daughter." No one moved. No one spoke. He carefully placed the letter aside and opened the estate folder. "As for the legal matters," he said, "your father updated his estate plan 18 months ago. Several documents were slid across the table. The family home has been sold according to your father's instructions. The proceeds have been divided exactly as outlined in his will." Vanessa looked up immediately. "What about the house?" "He promised it would stay in the family." Michael calmly shook his head. "There is no document supporting that claim." He lifted another signed paper. "Your father instead established a scholarship fund for the children of military families using a substantial portion of his estate. The remaining assets have been divided equally between his two daughters." Vanessa's face lost all color. "So, there isn't some secret inheritance for me?" "There is an inheritance," Michael replied evenly. "Just not the one you convinced yourself existed." For the first time since the funeral, no one defended Vanessa. The truth wasn't hidden in money. It had been written in their father's own words all along, leaving every excuse, every rumor, and every accusation with nowhere left to hide. The weeks after the meeting passed more quietly than I ever imagined. For the first time in years, my phone stopped buzzing with criticism, guilt, or demands to be the bigger person. Instead, it filled with messages I wasn't ready to answer. My mother wrote first. Asterisk, "Your father was right. I should have defended you long ago. I'm sorry for every time I stayed silent." Asterisk, a few days later, one of my aunts admitted she had believed Vanessa's version of events without ever asking for mine. Even Daniel sent a brief message. Asterisk, "I respected your service long before the funeral. I should have spoken up sooner." Asterisk, the only message that remained unread was Vanessa's. It was several pages long. She apologized for the funeral, for years of resentment, and for turning the family against me. Whether her regret came from genuine reflection or from finally facing the truth, I honestly didn't know. For the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need to decide. Forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. I chose to let go of the anger, but I also chose to protect the peace I had spent decades building. I wished my family well, then quietly stepped back from the relationships that had always required me to shrink myself to make someone else feel important. Months later, I visited my father's grave alone. The fresh flowers swayed gently in the breeze as I stood in silence, remembering the man who had finally found the courage to tell the truth, even if it came too late for him to say it in person. I rested my hand against the cool stone and smiled. "I'm okay now, Dad." For the first time, those words were completely true. I had spent years believing that earning another promotion, another medal, or another achievement might finally convince my family that I was enough. It never could. Peace arrived only when I stopped asking people to value me after they had repeatedly chosen not to. My father's final letter hadn't changed who I was. It had simply revealed the truth that had always been there. As I walked back toward my car beneath the quiet afternoon sky, I wasn't leaving my family behind out of bitterness. I was leaving behind the need for their approval, and that freedom became the greatest inheritance my father ever gave me.